So let's talk capacity, but capacity in a different sense. I know I feel like I say this all the time. Let's talk capacity. But here's the thing. Capacity shrinking, but nothing's happening. Big fleets are getting rid of trucks, but nothing's happening. That's today on Logistics Life. Hey there, my friends. Welcome back. Dean, welcome back, my man. It's always great. I'm looking forward to today's conversation because when you brought this to me, and I mean, I don't know where this conversation is going to go because we never usually do. But one thing about it, my man, is that, you know, there's this constant view of capacity in the market. What's happening? How is it? When is it going to get back to balance? When are we going to do this? And you brought up something very interesting that we're going to touch on, that you were saying that a lot of the larger companies are reducing capacity, but yet it's not really making an impact in the market.
Mm-hmm. There's always a lag, I think, Dan, between when you read, you're reading the market signs and when you actually get to that point where the market turns, right? So right now, it feels like large truckload carriers have been chasing the market, right? So what I mean by that is they've been reducing their capacity for 8 quarters now, right? And they're still not at market equilibrium. So what they're trying to, and it's hard, it's not like it's cause and effect. You know, I get rid of 100 trucks this week and suddenly the market turns. It's a massive market. And these large truckload carriers only represent a small fraction of the market, maybe 10% of the market of the trucks on the road, right? The large mega carriers.
Mm-hmm.
Owner-operators represent about the same number of trucks on the road, right? So there's a couple of metrics you've got to watch. The large truckload carriers, according to the Journal of Commerce Truckload Capacity Index, is down to, and I'll quote you the number for the end of the second quarter, to 76.9. So just to level set those that don't know how the index works, what Bill Cassidy did is he indexed the number of trucks on the road for the large publicly held companies, the public carriers that do a quarterly report, and they'd say we had 10,000 trucks on the road. He takes the average of all of the earnings calls and has built an index that was at 100 in 2006, which was when we had the most trucks produced ever in that year built and the most trucks on the road. So today we are at 77% of the 2006 number. Right, so we've got less trucks than we did in 06. So fast forward to the peak of the pandemic when we had 93.2% of the 2006 number. Right, so at the peak of the pandemic, we had a lot of trucks on the road. So if you had, and I'll put it in numbers, if you had 93,000 trucks on the road in the middle of 2022, you've got 76,000 on the road now. So that's how much capacity has dropped. They've dropped about 16% of their capacity over 8 quarters, chasing the market down as the market softened, volumes have fallen. And remember, volumes are still sliding. Like volumes are still flat to softening, maybe down slightly year over year. Jason Miller pegged current truckload volume at the last quarter of 2018 levels. The challenge is, Dan, we've got a lot more trucks on the road compared to 2018 still today.
Yeah.
So that's why. So that's why they're chasing the market, trying to find that point where. So it's a dangerous game, right? Because if you jettison capacity out of your business and the market turns, suddenly you're scrambling. And I think what they're trying to do is figure out what's the timing of when will the market turn, and nobody really knows. Because the last few earnings calls say we think the second half will be better, right? They're not sure, and nobody is. But Mark,
and I mean that's the whole crystal ball thing, and give me the lottery numbers, right? Like that's a lottery.
But the large carriers, all of the large carriers, have said we are clearly at the bottom of the market. So freight conditions are weak, and overcapacity still exists in the market. So they're the headwinds they face. Now, when you look at some of the big numbers, like all the US manufacturing numbers are coming out not good. Like, Dan, the ISM PMI came out down again. the market, that side of the industry that produces a lot of truckload volume is weakening. Big manufacturers like John Deere, AGCO, Case New Holland, nearshoring to Mexico, staff layoffs at all of those big Midwest factories. The ISM PMI came in at about 48.5. New orders, which you sort of say, new orders tell me about freight to come down the road. It was down. New orders were down about 2 percentage points. So if you think about you're a large truckload carrier and you're trying to see where demand is for your trucks, there's still no signals that sort of say it's going to increase. It's just going to continue moving sideways. That's sort of the best scenario. So the only other option you've really got is to keep reducing capacity till you get to a point where the market bottoms out and you don't have to drop your price anymore. So I'll finish up on this point, because new rates coming into routing guides based on a recent RFP are still dropping about 2%. So a brand new rate in a routing guide for a lane is coming in 2% lower than the rate it was agreed to last year. Now, low single digits is good because it was double-digit rate decreases last year. So shippers have still got pricing power. Rates are still falling, albeit at a slower rate. And that's why large truckload capacity is still reducing, because they're still chasing this inflection point where new rates that they're agreeing to with shippers are no longer lower than the rates they're replacing. So we're still in this down cycle, Dan. And that's the challenge for the large mega fleets, is where to pick this inflection point.
So I'm curious, Dean, because it's interesting that this is the conversation today. Over the weekend, we were at a friend's place, and I met this individual who's owned a haulage company in our area for a very long time. They sold, I'm going to say 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago, just before the pandemic. And we were talking because he's no longer in the industry. It was his dad's company. So, you have that second generation kind of thing, but this was one of the ones that was really working out. And he said, it's interesting, Dan, he said, I was talking to my dad, and my dad said, and it was like tanker hauling, gravel hauling, that kind of stuff. So they had a bunch of tankers for liquid. A lot of the times it was water for Nestle and that kind of stuff. He said, we made more money in the 90s than any other decade. And he goes, and my dad started it in 1979.
Wow.
He goes, through the 80s, we made money. He goes, it was very close, 80s and 90s. He goes, we got into the 2000s. It was okay. He goes, but in the last 5 years, so from like 2000 kind of, so if he got rid of it 7 years ago, so I'm going to say probably 2010, 2012 for the last 5 years. He goes, it was a nightmare to make money.
Wow.
And they had their own shop and everything. Like everything was in-house. So it wasn't like, you didn't have the added expense, right? Now you got obviously added expenses of buildings and stuff. And I found it very interesting because I said, do you talk to anybody in the industry now? And he says, oh yeah. He says, like, I'm still very good friends with a lot of his contacts. He says, and they are struggling like you would not believe, Dan. And he goes, and he says, it's interesting. And there's something else that he brought up. And I think it happens all the time. I've experienced it. He was saying that a lot of the invoicing is getting cut back arbitrarily as well, from what he was told. So meaning like detention charges and all this stuff that was always normal. Now companies are fighting it. And then it's interesting because we talk about, just before we hit record, I was telling you about the challenges that we faced in the last few weeks with onboarding a new supplier and this kind of stuff, and companies saying, we're not working with carriers for that have less than a year's worth of authorities, or 2 years, or 2 years on the road because of all this fraud and in cyber and all these things happening, and part of me says this is all kind of pieces that lead to a massive hurricane or tornado in the industry, I think.
Right. Dan, I think you're right. This is always the challenge with the market, because you tend to overshoot your expectations. I think what will happen is we overshot the amount of trucks needed because then the pandemic ended kind of from a freight perspective in that second quarter of 2022, and the wheels literally fell off. I think what will happen this time around is capacity exiting will overshoot where the market is, and everybody will be scrambling for trucks, and then suddenly we'll be back to paying detention, looking for carriers, getting them on and off loading docks quickly. Carriers with less than a year's experience will suddenly be back in vogue. That's how this market works. But I think what tempers our expectations this time around is, it's the recency bias. The most recent market cycle we had was off the charts. The pandemic influenced freight market, the most recent one. And of course, the downside of that was overwhelming because we went up so high and we fell so hard. And that's what people are looking at. And if you are new to the industry and that's all you saw, you'd have a hard time trying to figure out where this market's going. Because right now, this market looks, and again, we've said this before, Dan, in a bizarre way, it looks a lot like what it did in 2019, coming out of 18 into 2019. The big difference for your carriers, though, is operating costs are about 20 cents a mile higher than where they were in 2019. So that's the impact of, that's why people are really finding it hard to survive right now, is because it costs more to do everything, assuming you can get something done. So, and large carriers and small are all facing the same problems. It's just that the demand is not there to sustain any sort of freight growth. Now, jobs numbers last week maybe suggested that the interest rate hikes have been fairly aggressive and maybe we warrant some interest rate drops. Maybe that's on the cards in September, is a decrease in interest rates. That could prove to be a catalyst. But Dan, I don't see much change ahead of the election. The US election, I think, is going to just put everyone in a holding pattern. And not,
I think so too.
Yeah. I think there's all sorts of crazy things that can happen with a change in administration. And I think that's got a lot of people worried. And then, of course, Dan, on top of all that, you've got these externalities that are unseasonal, right? So you've got the International Longshoremen Association, the ILA, Gulf Coast, East Coast Labor Agreement expires on September 30, right? So they're talking a really big game about strike action on the Eastern Gulf Coast ports. So again, another externality that could drive the market in a different direction. And that's why you're seeing a really hot market emerge around Los Angeles again, because that's where half our imports come. People are, and Dan, this gets to, this is kind of relational to you talking to shippers about capacity, because by the time you get to August 15 and you add on a 30-day transit time from Asia, you're at a point where to reach stores for Black Friday sales and Thanksgiving, you're kind of past the point of no return. So right now, we're seeing, what you'll see, I think, in Los Angeles in particular, is this pull forward of inventory. It'll become a really hot freight market in Los Angeles, Ontario in particular, because that's where half our imports come in. People are going to be rushing to get them into Los Angeles in particular. We don't know how bad Hurricane Debbie is going to impact Charleston and Savannah this week, because they're talking historic flooding right now that's going on. So again, you start to see a flooding event, Dan, takes a while, like a long time for that water to recede, and all of those inland rivers that go all the way through that 95 corridor. So there's some things happening right now that could upset the market. But I think regionally, though, the West Coast is going to be a very hot freight market for shippers and carriers and brokers. Like there'll be tight capacity and there'll be a lot of volume to move inland. Now,
would you not also see as we get, now obviously with US politics anyways, you've got, both sides that have their people running. Now's when a lot of the conversations are going to come about, possible new tariffs and all this. I mean, I know when Trump was in 2016, he did a lot of that work, like redoing the NAFTA agreement and, can US-Mexico border agreement. But I also know when that happened, there was a huge pull forward of people pulling inventory, and it almost preceded the COVID launch because of the amount of inventory. So, and then, when I look at it, because we've talked many times on this show where there could, I mean, even though the necessity in manufacturing and all that might not be a piece of the puzzle that's going to help the freight market.
Right.
We're, one major storm away. We're one major political event away.
Yep.
We're one major geoeconomical event away, or geopolitical event away from creating a different market, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And the one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, Dean, and I'd love your thought on it, is the way these markets turn, right?
Yep.
So if we just go back to 2018-19, 2018 was ELD. You and I both know most of the people were already on ELD.
Right.
I believe it was a little bit of a game, if you will, and I don't mean any ill intent to anyone watching or listening, but I don't think numbers should have increased. Pricing should have increased the way it increased, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right, like we both can agree on that. During COVID,
right?
I see, because so many people started pulling freight forward, there was this capacity crunch. Right. But I also don't believe prices, the way they double, triple, some of them were mid triple digits, increase in rates.
Yeah,
I don't think that was accurate to what was happening. I mean, I believe, like, trust me, we all felt it. We went to the grocery store. Groceries were like we're experiencing all these more expensive things.
Yeah.
And now it's this constant, I'm going to call it a battle, Dean. I don't even know if that's the right wording of it, but it's this constant back and forth. And the way I'm feeling about it, and please, anyone watching or listening, comment, let us know. It's almost as if you screwed me for the last 2 years, so I'm going to screw you for as long as I can. Yeah. And it's this constant battle back and forth. Instead of sitting down, with your customers and saying, okay, listen, there's going to be ebbs and flows in the market.
Right.
Why don't we come up with something that's good for you,
good
for me? You are profitable because we're not eating up 10% of your cost your shipping cost. But yet we're able to make money, and let's just work together long term. And I think that part of the conversation is missing. I don't know. And maybe some of you are having it, which is awesome. Yeah. But I look at this, and then I look at the fraud in the market. I look at everything that's happening in our market.
Right.
And I can see why a lot of people are so down. Are so, like, they're getting this rejection whiplash, and they're I think, like anything, right? We try for so long to make things happen. Eventually we get frustrated. We get, turned off, I guess, for lack. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's one of the core tenets of your business and the sales training is the relationships and the partnerships. It's the discussions. It's the transparency. Because I think what's happening now is a lot of people have become too transactional. Right. So shippers in particular, and I can't blame them. I just think it's a dangerous game when you play the market down. And when you drive the market down by reducing freight rates, at some point you get to a level where the rates aren't sustainable. Right. Mm-hmm. So right now, spot rates for a dry van carrier are around where it costs to break even on a truck. You're not making a lot of money. But what you'll start to see, the paper rates or the contract rates based on the contract market negotiations, you'll start to see rejection rates go through the roof. And then shippers are left holding the bag, trying to move freight at a much higher cost. So that's the downside of this is I think it took a while for the market to ramp up capacity to meet demand during the pandemic. And then by the time the market turned in 2022, they had too much capacity. And it'll be the same on the way down in this cycle. 8 consecutive quarters of capacity decreasing and 27 months of rates being negative year over year has been a windfall on the shipping side of the community, right? So they've been able to recoup some of the losses from the pandemic. But at some point, you've got to say enough is enough, and we think we've got to start to lock in capacity, which I think the savvy shippers have been doing that. But then a lot of the small carriers, small shippers, I think they've been playing the market down, and that's going to hurt them when it comes time to calling a broker to try and move freight, because the carriers just won't be there, Dan. That's why, one of the reasons is operating costs are 20 cents a mile higher than where they were before the pandemic. But that's going to create a new floor for pricing when it comes to moving freight in the spot market. I think that's where you're going to see some of the resistance from carriers to say, hey, I can't haul your freight anymore. I think the shoe will be on the other foot by the time we get in, certainly by this time next year, well and truly.
I agree. You know, one other thing that I think we should address when we're talking about this capacity and how it works is, you know, I think now more than ever, I mean, I think for a lot of brokers, it was very difficult during COVID to create relationships because there was just the ability for carriers, for asset companies to say, okay, well, you know, you're offering me 50 and this guy's offering me 2,500, right? And, you know, I think, again, we've, you know, touched base on this fraud aspect, but I think now more than ever, the reason fraud is happening is because people are at the end of their ropes, and they're looking for anything to grab onto. Right. So if they can grab onto a couple of loads that are paying $500, $1,000. And one thing that I've noticed is a little bit different this time around in speaking with people is the rates aren't astronomically higher than what they did, like back, if you look back kind of 2005 and 6, when a lot of this really started coming out, right? Where they would, you know, go to a shipper and say $1,000, and the shipper normally paid 1,800, and they're like, oh my Lord, okay, I'll take it. And then they go to the market and they'd say 2,800, and it was like they're like, oh my God, you're paying 28. Yeah, okay, I'll take it. Now I think people got aware of that, or more vigilant to it. But now, from the people I'm speaking with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is the numbers are more in line, where it's not necessarily too good to be true. It's right at that borderline, like right at that fine as a razor's edge, with like, it could be, but it might not be. So I got to take the chance. And I think that's where this is all coming from, is people are taking those chances just to keep the lights on. And I think it's, you know, it does a couple of things. It creates a time and place for so many things to change. And like I was telling you, we're working with a small supplier right now where it's unreal how many people don't want to sign them up because they're new, but they're not. They're just new in the US. And like you said, well, how does somebody get a start? And you know, this is what ruins it for everyone else, because I'll tell you, I have found the best care and the worst. Don't get me wrong. I've had both sides of the equation, right? 100%. But I found the best and the worst when it was like a one-off emergency. Somebody stepped in and said, I can do this for you. I can make it happen. And they became best friends and moved a ton of freight, and I helped them grow and everything. You know, and on the other side, yes, I've had times where you know, we've talked about it, where you hang up the phone, you're going, oh man, I'm not gonna sleep for 2 days until this thing delivers, right? What are your thoughts there, Dean? What do you see moving in that end of the field?
I think the key, and I'll put this in a shipper's perspective here. I think any shipper that's got unplanned freight is going to really struggle, right? There's already signs that's happening. Spot rates are going up for those sort of unplanned loads, right? So spotlight, even night swift. So if you think about Mark Schneider said on his recent earnings call, spot rates were higher than contract rates in the latter part of July, which was it got my attention, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So, and then Night Swift came out and said much the same thing. They said that unplanned freight, for example, is no longer being booked at a discount, and tender rejections are starting to rise. So I think there's already warning signs for those really small shippers that have taken that chance, that the market's starting to turn on them. And that's where I think we'll see most of the pain as we move through this year, is the unplanned side of things, which is what the spot market moves a lot of, is that overflow unplanned type freight. So if you're working with a shipper, you need to make sure that you've got predictability, good negotiations, good discussions, a little bit on the table for both sides, not playing the market down. And I think that's going to be key to survival for anybody in this next 6 months.